there is something interesting about these two books being paired. I mean, they're two novels set in vastly different places, New York in The Friend, and Moscow in A Terrible Country. And they nonetheless bear the essential similarity of being about narrators who are tasked with caring for another. In Nunez's The Friend, the narrator, a writer filled with immense loathing and anxiety over her profession, inherits an enormous dog, a Great Dane, from her recently dead friend, another writer with whom she had a complex relationship, to understate the case somewhat. The novel's voice is alternately pugnacious, weary, sharp, and cruel. In one sentence, the narrator writes, "In the book I'm reading, the author talks about word people versus fist people, as if words cannot also be fists, aren't often fists. Though caring for the dog is at once a manner of processing grief, it also becomes a way back, however circuitously, into literature itself for the writer, into a different and renewed understanding of what it means to write under the deepening constraints of a society that constantly throws terrible statistics at you over declining rates of reading, in a society that makes it increasingly hard to stay in your apartment." Terrible Country is also set in a small apartment, this in the center of Moscow, where the graduate student Andrei arrives to take care of his ailing grandmother. It too is obsessed with money and with work, the price of coffee in Russia's newly expensive cafes, the dwindling store of academic jobs that the narrator feels ever less suited for. But the growing sense of constriction in this excellent book is, on the one hand, an opening to the world of post-Soviet Russia, to the world of hockey. There are a lot of excellent hockey scenes in this book. Keith will not read from one of them, unfortunately, but you should read from one of them, of late-night off-license cars, of reading groups by socialists rediscovering the ideas of Marxism, somewhat out of the shadow of the Soviet Union. Like The Friend, A Terrible Country also opens questions about commitment. In Gessen's novels, about the depth of commitment one can make to friends, comrades, and adopted countries under the pressures of early 20th century capitalism, when careers and other forms of success threaten to undo all those relationships. Sigrid Nunez, this is her 7th novel. It is the winner recently of the National Book Award. She is also the author of corresponding memoir, of working for and living with Susan Sontag, Sempre Susan. Keith Gessen is, I'm very proud to introduce, he will be reading first. He is a colleague and an old friend of mine, the co-founder of N+1. This is his 2nd novel. He's the author of several other books, editor and author of several other books. And it's my pleasure to welcome him to the stage first. Please give a pause for Keith.
Thank you, Nikhil, for that amazing introduction. Thank you all for coming out. I was going to introduce the book a bit, but Nikhil did a much better job than I would. Anyway, it's called A Terrible Country. When I named it that, it was very clear. This was like 2014, 2015. It was clear which country I meant, Russia. Now I have to explain. But yeah, there's enough terrible countries to go around. So I'm going to read from the beginning. In late summer of 2008, I moved to Moscow to take care of my grandmother. She was about to turn 90, and I hadn't seen her for nearly a decade. My brother Dima and I were her only family. Her lone daughter, our mother, had died years earlier. Baba Seva lived alone now in her old Moscow apartment. When I called to tell her I was coming, she sounded very happy to hear it, and also a little confused. My parents and my brother and I left the Soviet Union in 1981. I was 6 and Dima was 16, and that made all the difference. I became an American, whereas Dima remained essentially Russian. As soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, he returned to Moscow to make his fortune. Since then, he had made and lost several fortunes. Where things stood now, I wasn't sure. But one day he G-chatted me to ask if I could come to Moscow and stay with Baba Sieva while he went to London for an unspecified period of time. Why do you need to go to London? I said. I'll explain when I see you. You want me to drop everything and travel halfway across the world and you can't even tell me why? There was something petulant that came out of me when dealing with my older brother. I hated it and couldn't help myself. Dima said, if you don't want to come, say so, but I'm not discussing this on GChat. You know, I said, there's a way to take it off the record. No one will be able to see it. Don't be an idiot, said Dima. He meant to say that he was involved with some very serious people who would not so easily be deterred from reading his GChats. Maybe that was true, maybe it wasn't. With Dima, the line between those concepts was always shifting. As for me, I wasn't really an idiot. But neither was I not an idiot. I had spent 4 long years of college and then 8 much longer years of grad school studying Russian literature and history, drinking beer, and winning the grad student cup hockey tournament 5 times. Then I had gone out onto the job market for 3 straight years with 0 results. By the time Dima wrote me, I had exhausted all the available postgraduate fellowships and had signed up to teach online sections in the university's new PMOOC initiative, short for Paid Massive Online Open Course, although the paid part mostly referred to the students who really did need to pay, and less to the instructors who were paid very little. It was definitely not enough to continue living, even very frugally, in New York. In short, on the question of whether I was an idiot, there was evidence on both sides. So he packs up his stuff, has a little going-away party, and falls asleep on the plane. Next thing I knew, I was standing in the passport control line in the grim basement of Sheremetyevo II International Airport. It never seemed to change. As long as I'd been flying in here, they made you come down to this basement and wait in line before you got your bags. It was like a purgatory from which you suspected you might be entering someplace other than heaven. But the Russians looked different than I remembered them. They were well dressed, with good haircuts, and talking on sleek new cell phones. Even the guards in their light blue short-sleeved uniforms looked cheerful. Though the line was long, several stood off to the side, laughing. Oil was selling at $114 a barrel, and their army had just won a short little war with Georgia. Is that what they were laughing about? Modernization theory said the following: wealth and technology are more powerful than culture. Give people nice cars, color televisions, and the ability to travel to Europe, and they'll stop being so aggressive. No 2 countries with McDonald's franchises will ever go to war with one another. People with cell phones are nicer than people without cell phones. I wasn't so sure. The Georgians had McDonald's and the Russians bombed them anyway. As I neared the passport booth, a tall, bespectacled, nicely dressed European, Dutch or German, asked in English if he could cut the line. He had to catch a connecting flight. I nodded yes. We'd have to wait for our luggage anyway. But the man behind me, about the same height as the Dutch guy, but much sturdier, in a boxy, but not to my eyes, inexpensive suit, piped up in Russian accented English. Go back to end of line. I'm about to miss my flight, said the Dutchman. Go back to end of line. I said to him in Russian, Какая разница? What's the difference? Большая разница, he answered. There's a big difference. Please? The Dutchman asked again in English. I said go back, now. The Russian turned slightly so that he was square with the Dutchman. The latter man kicked his bag in frustration. Then he picked it up and walked to the back of the line. He made the correct decision, said the Russian guy to me in Russian, indicating that as a man of principle, he was ready to pummel the Dutch guy for cutting the line. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, I approached the passport control booth. The young, blonde, unsmiling guard took my battered blue American passport, the passport of a person who lived in a country where you didn't have to carry your passport everywhere you went, where in fact you might not even know where your passport was for months and years at a time, with mild disgust. If he had a passport like mine, he'd take better care of it. He checked my name against the terrorist database and buzzed me through the gate to the other side. I was in Russia again. So he takes the train into town, and then to his grandmother's house, and they have lunch, and then they have the following conversation. She started to get up to try to put away the plates, but I implored her to sit, less in that moment because I wanted to help than because she did everything so slowly. I quickly cleared the table and started doing the dishes. As I was finishing, my grandmother came over and made to ask a question that I could tell she thought might be a little delicate. "Andrusha," she said, "you are such a dear person to me, to our whole family, but I can't remember right now. How did we come to know you?" I was momentarily speechless. "I'm your grandson," I said. There was an element of pleading in my voice. "What?" "I'm your grandson." "My grandson," she repeated. "You had a daughter, do you remember?" "Yes," she said uncertainly, and then remembered. "Yes, my little daughter." She thought a moment longer. "She went to America," said my grandmother. "She went to America and died." "That's right," I said. My mother had died of breast cancer in 1992. The first time my grandmother saw her after our emigration was at her funeral. "And you," she said now, "I'm her son." My grandmother took this in. "Then why did you come here?" she said. I didn't understand. "This is a terrible country. My Yolka took you to America. Why did you come back?" She seemed angry. I was again at a loss for words. Why had I come? Because Dima had asked me to, and because I wanted to help my grandmother, and because I thought it would help me find a topic for an article which would then help me get a job. These reasons swirled through my mind like an argument, and I decided to go with the one that seemed most practical. "For work," I said. "I need to do some research." "Oh," she said. "All right." She too had had to work in this terrible country, and she could understand. Momentarily satisfied, my grandmother excused herself and went to her room to lie down. I remained in the kitchen, drinking another cup of tea. Throughout the apartment were photos of our family, and especially my mother, on walls, on dressers, on bookshelves. In America, our family had become scattered. In Moscow, it was exactly where it had always been. Holy shit, I thought. This was not the state in which I had expected to find my grandmother. Dima said she was on medication for dementia, but I hadn't really understood. My first thought was, I'm not qualified. I'm not qualified to care for an 89-year-old woman who can't remember who I am. I was a person who had indulged in an unthinkable amount of schooling and then failed to convert that schooling into an actual job. "I just don't see where this is going," Sarah had said at the Starbucks. Sarah is his ex-girlfriend who dumped him at a Starbucks before he left. "Why does it have to go somewhere?" I said, lamely. She just shook her head. "I may regret this," she said, "but I doubt it." And she was right. I was an idiot, like Dima said, and I was in over my head. That first day in the kitchen was the first time, the first of many, that I would decide to leave. In my mind, I began composing an email to Dima. "Dima," it went, "I feel that you misled me about the condition our grandmother is in. Or maybe I misunderstood you. I can't handle this. I'm sorry. Let's hire someone who knows what they're doing. I'll help pay for it. And then I'd go back to New York. There's no shame in knowing your limitations." Though how exactly I'd help pay for it was a mystery. After buying my visa and my ticket, I had less than $1,000 to my name. My grandmother came out of her room and crossed the foyer to the toilet. She had gone to bed clearly and then gotten up again. Her hair was mussed and she was still without her teeth. Seeing me, she gave a toothless smile and a wave. I felt like she knew who I was in that moment. I calmed down. So I was to keep her company. Maybe even an idiot could do that. Who cared if she couldn't remember certain things? Her life had been so wonderful, such a parade of joys, that she should sit around remembering everything about it. She wouldn't be able to tell me the story of her life for my would-be article, but I'd find something else to write about. And maybe she wouldn't know who I was all the time. I knew who I was, and I could remind her. I was the youngest son of her daughter, her lone child, my mother, who had gone to America and died. I got up and washed my teacup and headed for my bedroom. Thank you.
I want to thank the Free Library of Philadelphia for inviting me to be here tonight and thank all of you for being here. So I'm reading from my novel, The Friend, and in the book, the narrator has lost her best friend and her lifelong friend and mentor, who has committed suicide. It's unexpected. He hasn't left a note, but he has left behind his 180-pound Great Dane, whom she inherits. But it's a rescue dog, so his history is not known. And so there they are. The dog is in mourning. The woman is in mourning, and they are squeezed into her 500 square foot apartment where no dogs are allowed. And as I say, they're both in a stunned state of grief. And when she refers to you, as she does at times, she is referring to the friend who committed suicide. Advice often given to writers: read your drafts out loud. Advice I am usually too lazy to follow. But I will try anything these days that might keep me longer at my desk. I pick up the pages I've just printed out and start reading. Behind me, I hear Apollo, who has been sleeping behind the couch, heave himself to his feet. He trots to the desk. We are about eye to eye when I'm sitting, and stares at me as if I'm doing something remarkable. Or maybe, though we've had one long walk already today, he wants to go out again. When I reach the bottom of the page, I pause, thinking. Apollo pokes me with his nose. He barks very low just once. He takes a step forward, a step to the right, a step back, all the while cocking his head from side to side, his way of saying WTF. He wants me to keep reading. True or not, that's what I do, but soon I stop. Read your sentences out loud, goes the advice, and you'll hear what doesn't sound right, what doesn't work. I hear what doesn't sound right, what doesn't work. I hear, no different from when I read the sentences to myself. I fold my arms on the desk and hide my face in them. Poke, woof. I turn my head. Apollo's gaze is deep. He licks my face and does the cha-cha thing again. He wags his tail, and for the 1,000th time, I think how frustrating it must be for a dog, the endless trouble of making yourself understood to a human. I move from chair to couch, Apollo watching, forehead creased. Once I'm settled, he comes and sits down in front of me, eye to eye. What do dogs think when they see someone cry? Bred to be comforters, they comfort us. But how puzzling human unhappiness must be to them. We who can fill our dishes any time and with as much food as we like, who can go outside whenever we wish and run free, we who have no master constantly needing to be pleased or obeyed, WTF. From the stack of books on the coffee table, I pick up Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, an assigned book for one of the courses I'm teaching. I open it and start reading out loud. After a few pages, Apollo assumes the half-open-mouthed smile seen all the time on other dogs' faces, but with worrying infrequency on his. As I keep reading, he lowers himself to the floor, covering my feet and pressing against my shins. He relaxes his head onto his paws, tipping his eyes at me each time I turn a page. The position of his ears shifts in response to my vocal inflections. I read on as clearly and with as much expression as I would to someone who could understand every word, and I too find it soothing. The lyrical prose in my mouth, the great, warm, gently heaving weight on my legs and feet. I know this little book well. 10 letters addressed to a student who'd written to ask Rilke for advice when Rilke himself was just 27 years old. Letter 8 contains his famous vision of the Beauty and the Beast myth. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. Beware irony, ignore criticism, look to what is simple, study the small and humble things of the world, do what is difficult precisely because it is difficult. Do not search for answers, but rather love the questions. Do not run away from sadness or depression, for these might be the very conditions necessary to your work. Seek solitude. Above all, seek solitude. I have read Rilke's advice so often I know it by heart. When I read the letters for the first time at around the same age as Rilke when he wrote them, I felt that they had been written as much to me as to their addressee, that all this wonderful advice was meant for any person who wished to become a writer. Once again, I come upon his famous definition of love, two solitudes that protect and border and greet each other. What does that even mean, writes a student in her final paper? It's just words. It has nothing to do with real life, which is where love actually happens. The exasperated, hostile tone so often to be found in student papers. In real life, he could not be a husband to his wife, whom he left about a year after their marriage. He could not be a father to his daughter. Rilke, who found such richness and meaning in the experience of childhood, and who wrote so many beautiful words about children, neglected his only child, which did not stop her from dedicating her life to his work and his memory. Then, aged 71, she killed herself. Rilke, who loved dogs and looked hard at them and shared a boundless communion with them, who once found in the imploring look of an ugly, heavily pregnant stray that he encountered outside a cafe in Spain, everything that probes beyond the solitary soul and goes God knows where, into the future or into that which passeth understanding. He fed her the lump of sugar from his coffee, which, he later wrote, was like reading Mass together. Rilke, in whose work Apollo is a recurring figure. The book is short. It can be read aloud in about 2 hours, but soon Apollo has dropped off like a child at whose bedside a mother has been reading and waiting for precisely this moment to tiptoe away. I'm not tiptoeing anywhere. Pinned beneath my weight, my feet have gone numb. Between his weight, my feet have gone numb. I wiggle them and he wakes. Without getting up, he seeks my hand, still holding the little book, and he licks it. Now we are both up, heading for the kitchen. I pour him some kibble, it's that time, and while he eats, I get ready to take him out. I might have dismissed the incident as something out of my anthropomorphic fancy, but the very next day, this happens. I'm sitting on the couch with my laptop when Apollo comes up and starts sniffing the books on the coffee table. His giant jaws open and close around the new paperback copy of the Knausgaard novel that I bought to replace the one he destroyed. Not again. But before I can take it away, he gently places the book by my side. I've heard of therapy dogs, of course. Dogs trained to work in hospitals, nursing homes, disaster areas, and the like. Their purpose to bring comfort and cheer in hopes of lightening whatever suffering humans might be going through. I know such dogs have been around a long time, also that they are now often used to help children with emotional or learning difficulties. To improve speech and literacy skills, children in schools and libraries are being encouraged to read aloud to dogs. Excellent results have been reported, with children who read to dogs said to progress significantly better than children who read to other humans. Many of the listeners are said to appear to enjoy themselves, showing signs of alertness and curiosity. But an analysis of the full benefits to canines of being read to by humans is not something my research turns up. It occurs to me that someone used to read to Apollo, Not that I think he was a trained, certified therapy dog. Would such a valuable animal end up astray? And I believe that someone must have read aloud to him, or if not to him, at least while he was present, and that his memory of that experience is a happy one. Maybe it was just that whoever did the reading was someone he loved. Or maybe, though not a professional therapy dog, Apollo had nevertheless been expected to help someone by listening to that person read, a responsibility he took seriously and for which he was praised and rewarded. It's in the nature of many dogs to do some kind of work, training manuals say. Assigned a task, dogs showing signs of boredom or depression often perk up, but people almost never give them enough, if anything, to do. Or maybe Apollo is a canine genius who has figured something out about me and books. Maybe he understands that when I'm not feeling so great, losing myself in a book is the best thing I could do. Maybe this is something his phenomenal nose tells him. If, as studies show, a dog's nose is capable of detecting cancer, it would not be surprising if it could also detect changes caused by the relief of stress or by the experience of mental stimulation or pleasure. If some dogs can predict seizures in people, as we know has occurred, how strange would it be for one to predict a looming fit of the blues? In fact, the more I live with Apollo, the more convinced I am that the vet was right. We humans don't know the half of how dogs' brains work. They may well, in their mute, unfathomable way, know us better than we know them. In any case, the image is irresistible. An avalanche of despair, and like the St. Bernard coming through the snow with a mini barrel of brandy, Apollo fetches a book. Even if we know St. Bernards never really did that. There was a time when it would have been clearer to me whether reading Rilke's letters to a young poet to a dog was a sign of mental unbalance. I decided to make reading aloud part of our routine, knowing how this might look to others, though I don't tell anyone. But then there's a lot in these pages I've never told anyone. It is curious how the act of writing leads to confession, not that it doesn't also lead to lying your head off. Like Rilke, Flannery O'Connor wrote a series of letters to a stranger who wrote to her one day out of the blue. In the collection of O'Connor's letters published after her death, this particular correspondent who'd asked to remain anonymous is called A. At 32, she is 2 years older than O'Connor, who is nevertheless more than up to shouldering the role of mentor. The letters to A, written over a period of 9 years, are filled with thoughts about literature and religion and what it means to be a writer and a believer in the Catholic Church. She talks freely about her fiction writing, and when A sends her some of her own fiction, the response is encouraging. A has a gift for story writing, O'Connor says, judging one particular story to be just about perfect. When A appears to be suffering from a block, O'Connor is quick to blame the devil. For the serious Catholic O'Connor, the devil is not a metaphor. Though in time the two women arrange to meet, they will not do so often. Meanwhile, on paper, the friendship thrives, bringing them close enough for O'Connor to call A her adopted kin. Overjoyed when A decides to join the church, she agrees to be her confirmation sponsor. But in the end, the devil won. A loses her faith. She leaves the church. Though she produces work in several genres, she publishes nothing. At 75, 34 years after O'Connor's death from lupus at the age of 39, Hazel Elizabeth Hester, known as Betty, shoots herself to death. If O'Connor had been my mentor, if she'd been writing to me, I might have asked her this: what exactly did Simone Weil mean when she said, When you have to make a decision in life about what you should do what will cost you the most. Do what is difficult because it is difficult. Do what will cost you the most. Who were these people? If writing wasn't painful, O'Connor says, it would not be worth doing. Turn then to Virginia Woolf, who said that putting feelings into words takes the pain away. Making a scene come right, making a character come together, there was no greater pleasure, she said. Watching Apollo sleep, the peaceful rise and fall of his flank. His belly is full, he is warm and dry. He has had a 4-mile walk today. As usual, when he hunched in the street to do his business, I guarded him from passing cars. And in the park, when a texting jogger bore down on us, Apollo barked and blocked his path before he could run into me. I have played several rounds of tug-of-war with him today. I have talked to him and sung to him and read him some poetry. I have trimmed his nails and brushed every inch of his coat. Now, watching him sleep, I feel a surge of contentment. There follows another, deeper feeling, familiar, singular and mysterious, yet at the same time perfectly familiar. I don't know why it takes a full minute for me to name it. What are we, Apollo and I, if not two solitudes that protect and border and greet each other? Thank you.
I thought I'd start the questioning by asking you, and it was sort of teed up, Sigrid, by the part that you read. If each of you could comment on the writers you chose to include the book, because each of the books seems very much in dialogue with other literature. And I wonder if you could talk about those writers and how they may have guided or interacted with what you wrote.
It wasn't something that I decided beforehand. I have this narrator who, who was going through this period of mourning and confusion, and also trying to take care of this dog that is also going through a troubled time, is spending most of her time alone with the dog, and and thinking about certain things. Very solitary. And she is a writer, and she is a teacher of writing, and she's a big reader. So while I was, writing about what would be going through her head, it would just come into my own head, certain writers and things that I remembered that were relevant, and then they came into the story. So I ended up with writers who had some connection to whatever part I was writing about. It wasn't as if I had decided beforehand that I wanted to include these writers that were important to me. But all of them, do turn out to be writers that are important to me.
It took me a very embarrassingly long time to write this book, and as I was trying to figure out a way to write about Russia without, without on the one hand minimizing how difficult and tragic its history has been, but also at the same time, especially as an American writing about Russia, I did not want to exaggerate those horrors. And that's, in writing about Russia, it's always been a sort of tricky balance. One of the writers that I really I'd read bits of, but really discovered while writing this book was a writer named Varlam Shalamov, who spent more than 20 years in the Gulag. And the interesting thing about, and he came out and he wrote these sort of kind of lapidary short stories about it, based on kind of life in the camps. But the interesting thing about him as a sort of writer and person, the sort of literary gossip about him, is that he hated Solzhenitsyn. And he felt like Solzhenitsyn hadn't been in a camp for very long. But he really kind of felt like Solzhenitsyn had really made a career out of being this kind of gulag guy. And Solzhenitsyn, who I admire greatly, but was also kind of, was into the kind of bigness of the gulag and writing in a big way about it. And Shalamov kind of wanted to write about it in a little way, in a kind of deflationary way, which I found very appealing. So for me, kind of Shalamov was the discovery. I have to say about the Rilke, my memory of that book, and it's really kind of redeemed in your retelling of it for me. But as I recall, the young poet is asking Rilke how to get an agent. He's asking him sort of practical advice.
It's true. It's true. It's true. And he gets this elevated discourse. Yes.
And my question is, I suppose it's intentional why you make the narrator nameless. Can you explain why to make her more representative of all writers?
I can't quite
Why
hear.
is the writer nameless in the book? Is that writer supposed to represent?
Why is the narrator nameless?
Yeah.
Well, it's not just the narrator. There are Apollo has a name, but I didn't end up with names for the human characters. And again, that wasn't something that I decided beforehand. It's interesting because this question was just asked of Anna Burns, who wrote Milkman, just won the Booker Prize, and she's word for word, really, she said exactly the same experience that I'd had. I had names for the characters. I had put names in there, and when I named them, the book stopped. The writing stopped. There was something in the way there. It wasn't working. So I took the names out, and then I was able to go on. So that's all it really was. It just didn't work. And when I saw her say that, I thought, yeah, this is. I'm not the only one. It's not just the two of us either. It was just something that didn't work. But it wasn't, it wasn't an idea or a principle or whatever that they should be unnamed. It just seemed fake. So that's the simple reason. It's not like when I write my next book. I mean, I don't know, and certainly in other books, my characters and narrators have had names. Not always, but more or less, yeah.
Keith is naming something that is important to you, and does it tend to kind of get in the way or open you up?
I also find it difficult to name, and I find it difficult to name the narrator. He's not me, and yet so much of me is in him, right? So to give him a name that wasn't mine was weird, and yet to give him my own name would be a kind of performative act that I also didn't want to take. Ultimately, I named him Andre Kaplan, which turned out to be a great idea because I was recently. Had a reading at a JCC, I think in Albuquerque, and it was right around Hanukkah. And this woman comes up, and she's got like 5 books. And I'm like, oh, great, my biggest fan. And she says, oh, Kaplan, that's my name. And I'm going to give this to all my relatives for Hanukkah. So, something to keep in mind. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Mr. Gessen, you mentioned that in 2014, it was obviously what country is terrible country. If you pick name now, what name would you choose? Thank you.
Oh, for the book? Oh, misunderstood and country. No, just kidding. I would still call it that. I mean, I feel, what's the reason the book is called that, as you learned from the section that I read, is that it's the grandmother who calls it that, right? It's not me, and I think that's an important distinction, right? It's a terrible country, but it's a terrible country that she has declined to leave, and it's a terrible country to which she has given her life, basically. And it's a terrible country, but it's her terrible country. So I'm sticking by it.
There's a point in each of your books, Keith, when Andre is brought in for the interrogation. I don't think I'm giving anything away here. And Sigrid, when the narrator asks, how should the story end? And in both cases, you challenge the reader, but draw us in deeper. And I'm wondering if you saw those scenes as risks, or if they just sort of followed on and made, this is what the story demanded.
Well, since I compose my books linearly, so instead of making an outline and then working in parts or whatever the way some other writers do. So I start at the beginning, and then I'm writing, and then I move on, and everything that happens in the book occurs to me while I'm doing it. I mean, I get my ideas while I'm writing it, and so by the time I finish it, except for it needing a certain amount of polishing, it's done, it's there. And so I had come to the next to the last chapter of the book, and that just something that occurred to me. How I right before that I'd been writing about how students often write stories that begin with someone getting up in the morning. Also, they begin with a funeral. Often that happens too. So I was just talking about that, student stories and how stories should begin or whatever. And then I just came to this part where I wrote, how should this story end? For a long time I thought it could or should, I forget, end like this. And then I have a kind of fantasy idea, that after all, this is a novel, this is fiction. I can, unlike real life, I can undead somebody. I can bring someone to life. I can make the end of that life in fiction turn out to have been different. And so it was just that. Now, so you're saying about the risk. I mean, the idea that it was a risky. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, but a risk worth taking. I mean, you do take risks when you're writing something. You don't know if people are going to understand the ending or why you've done this or that. But yeah.
I mean, for me, the interrogation scene where he's arrested and interrogated that was a very risky scene because by then you're sort of, Andre has kind of won the reader over to his side a bit, and he is about to lose the reader again, and that's risky. Yeah. And it needed to be. I mean, I thought that it was what had to happen, and I wanted it to kind of happen with sort of minimal, the least amount of damage to him, that he could come out of that while still having what happened happen. So that was it's pretty vague, but yes, that was a scary moment for me, and but I thought it had to happen, and yeah, I don't know what readers will think.
For Mr. Gessen, I had to check once or twice to make sure this was fiction. And I felt the relationship of the grandson and the grandmother was so dear, and then also with his friends. And I wonder if you'd mind telling us how autobiographical these relationships.
I don't mind. Some people mind. I don't mind.
A lot of people mind.
A lot of people mind. Yeah. I mean, I kind of, so I did go and take care of my grandmother in Moscow for a year. So, yeah, definitely based on that. And then when I was writing it, I wrote it in the first person, more or less as it happened. And then I kind of looked at it and I thought, oh, that's pretty boring. So I started changing some things to make, to give it a bit more of a narrative. And I mean, initially the narrator was really he was kind of a journalist and translator, which is what I was doing over there, and that was really boring to me actually. And then I turned him into an academic, and it became very exciting. strange as that sounds. For me, it just became a lot more fun to kind of write about it. And so yeah, that stuff is made up. But I have to say, as a reader, I love this about your book. You know that it's. A lot of it's made up, but you have this feeling that it's memoir, right? I really enjoy that feeling as a reader. So I'm glad you felt that way reading it.
Can you talk about the process of developing your characters when, for large parts of the novel, the reader's just kind of alone with the narrator's thoughts? No other characters or actions to kind of bounce off of them. It's largely just kind of their stream of consciousness, what they're thinking.
Well, it's interesting because you're always told that, and as a teacher, it's certainly something that comes up all the time in the workshop, and when you're dealing with student work, or when you're reviewing something or whatever. It's so important, the characters and what we call character development. But when you're actually writing, in a way, you don't really think, or at least I don't really think that way. I don't think about, I have to develop this character, and that means I have to do A, B, C, or I look at it and say this character is not developed enough. Basically, I just write, and then I feel like if you're writing about somebody's experiences and their thoughts are part of their experiences, the character is going to emerge. It comes from inside rather than outside. So. In this particular, people will say, well, don't tell me what characters are thinking, show them doing something. When people say that, I say, well, sometimes what they're doing is thinking. Often what they're doing is thinking if they're a certain kind of character. So for me, particularly since this character was so isolated and was in an extreme state, this grieving state, and the book only takes place in a fairly short period of time. For me, I thought that the book was going to, it was going to be successful only in as much as the reader was interested in her consciousness, and so again, that was another risk. She really doesn't do that much. There's not a great deal of suspense or plot or whatever, but. I wanted a big part of her character and character development to be the kind of way she observed things. So she is always observing things, and she brings in movies she's seen, books she's read, thoughts that occurred to her, what she observes by watching this dog. And, in a sense, I wouldn't really call that character development. I would really just call it, a being inside the head of the character. How do you feel about character development? I find it, I teach, but I really, because it's such an essential part of writing. But I have to be honest, I've never really understood what it meant. It just sounds so mechanical in a way. It just doesn't, yeah.
Well, to me, the question was also about how do you write a book in which not that much happens, and the character is mostly thinking, and it's really hard. I would say, I really admire your book for how much, how little happens. Although I would argue that there is some suspense about what's going to happen with the apartment, right? Is she going to, how exactly does she feel about this mentor who's killed himself, right? And is there going to be some resolution to that? So it's not plotless. Right?
Yeah, there's a story. Yeah. I prefer to use the word story to plot for that reason.
What's the difference?
Well, I think again it's about teaching partly, that somehow the idea of plot, people think of something, like Stephen King or a thriller or something, where the plots that, something very, very busy and very structured. And so you could still, think about stories and not novels, for example. You could write a story in which, ostensibly nothing happens and still have a story, though it doesn't really have a plot. So I think it's different.
Fair enough. Yeah, and so in my case, I mean, I actually kind of wanted to write a book that was more in the consciousness of even more than it is, and I found I couldn't get away with it. I just couldn't. So there's, insofar as he has kind of thoughts and interacts with literary works and movies. It's kind of along the principle of the Dog Me 95 collective of European filmmakers that I don't know that much about, but I know that they didn't have music in their movies unless somebody was actually playing music in the scene. So in the same way, if he and the grandmother go and see a movie, right? Some of the movies are invented actually, because I wanted to talk about something, but they have to go and see a movie, or he has to be teaching a book, right? It has to kind of organically appear in the story or plot.
Sigrid, there's a moment towards the end of the book where the narrator and the mentor are having a conversation, and it starts pretty specifically about a project and why it didn't come to fruition, but it quickly divulges into or becomes about whose voice should be heard, kind of in 2017, 2018, who should be doing the speaking, who should be doing the writing. And it gets, I wouldn't say tense, but it gets a little bit like the mentor kind of leaves it with like, well, should I be, with the kind of hanging question of, should I be writing? Should anybody be listening to me? And then it just kind of ends, like there's no resolution. I'm wondering if you could talk about the decision to put that kind of really prescient train of thought into the novel, and if you have more thoughts about that question, about who should be heard and who should be doing the writing.
I think there are questions. I mean, because part of the book, that is part of the idea that she's thinking about. The question is not just who should be heard, but her issue with when she has an assignment to write about these sex-trafficked women, and there are a lot of reasons why she's blocked at this time. But one of the things that she's trying to grapple with is that you're writing, you're making something, you're making an aesthetic object out of your work, out of your words, your language, and her thing is that she has this resistance to the idea of using somebody's extreme pain and humiliation and abuse to write a fine essay about and then get published and get some money for it. There's a block there, and in this imagined discussion with the mentor, where he says, "Well, yeah, it's called journalism." If everybody felt that way, then nobody would ever know about all kinds of things they need to know. So they just sort of argue back and forth about this. It's a completely, a fantasy on her part, this imagined discussion. And so I was really, I didn't really have answers to these questions. I really just sort of wanted to raise them. And then, she's suggesting that there are certain ideas now that if you are going to do something that might, for example, be called cultural appropriation, that one way to do it would be to take the money that you gain for it and give it to a cause that would help the people that you're writing about or whatever. And then he points out that in that case, you couldn't make a living, and that only rich people would be able to write what they wanted to write. So anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to raise all those questions, but I certainly don't have the answers to them. And also I wanted to raise them because they are questions that, where she's teaching, where he was teaching, that they do come up. all the time. And, you know, and I bring up Alexeyevich and her ideas about the idea that you know, we're not living in Chekhov's time anymore. That's not the kind of writer that our world needs. In her view, our world needs, the problems of our world, et cetera, need somebody who will use their skills as a writer, and she is a journalist after all, to give voice to people, you know, to collect other people's stories and present that, you know, to just be the voice of other people. I mean, I don't know. How do you feel about Alexeyevich's ideas about that? You know, her project, as it were.
Oh, I mean, her project's amazing.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. Yeah, yeah.
It's, I mean, it might be said.
Zinky Boys.
It might be said that she uses too much of her writerly tools in presenting those voices.
But it's very compelling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, we'll leave it at Alexeyevich and Gessen and Nunez. Please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you. Thank you.